I'm Cole Haddon, and what you're about to listen to is a bonus episode from Season 1 of 5 a.m. Story Talk. In this podcast bonus eps, my guests break down a seminal piece of art from their lives, what I describe as mini masterclasses, although not always on the subject you expect. These bonus episodes are exclusive to my paid supporters in the season they were originally published. But in the following season, they're each unlocked, one at a time, so everyone can listen to them alongside the new episodes. Your paid subscriptions get you early access to these bonus eps, months and months early, but they also help keep the lights on here. In fact, Season 2 of this podcast enjoys several production upgrades because so many of you believe in this multimedia arts and culture conversation. I hope you consider becoming a paid supporter yourself, which you can learn more about in the show notes. Now, enjoy this 5 a.m. Story Talk bonus episode, Story Talkers. I'm Cole Haddon, and welcome back to 5 a.m. Story Talk. I want to start by saying thanks for being a paid subscriber. I know things are pretty terrible out there at the moment, so it really does mean a lot to me and my ability to keep this podcast operating to have your support. Be sure to drop into the comments and ask any questions about this episode if you have any. You've certainly earned my time. I'm here again with Dark Horse Comics founder and CEO, Mike Richardson, also owner of the Things from Another World stores, head of Dark Horse Entertainment, responsible for some of your favorite films and TV series, and comic book writer. We'll be discussing a seminal piece of art from his life, or rather, as per Mike's suggestion, a seminal artist, Frank Frazetta, who is often called the godfather of fantasy art. From book covers to comic books to paintings and posters and even album covers, this guy did it all. His paintings were full of action and life, and from my perspective, a kind of sexual energy, whether his subjects were men or women. When I think of Conan the Barbarian, the images that pop up in my mind are all Frazetta's, for example. I hope you enjoyed this incredibly intimate conversation, not just about Frazetta's work and its impact on Mike, but Mike's personal relationship with Frazetta, which they shared for the final 10 years of Frazetta's life. Okay, ready? Let's get into it. Welcome back, Mike. It's been a great conversation. When I first asked you to join me for it, I asked you to pick a seminal piece of artwork from your life for us to interrogate together, and your answer was a bit of a twist on the request, as it focused instead on the singular art of a legendary fantasy painter I love. Can you tell me and the listeners about the artist you want to discuss today?
Well, the artist that I decided, and I could talk about a lot of artists, but the one that probably had the most effect on me and the earliest. In fact, I was an art major, and my final masterpiece painting that I was doing to end my college career, my art instructor walked up and said, Frazetta already did it. That was the end of that. So I did something completely different. So it was Frank Frazetta, who, we talked earlier that I could read before I got into school. And in I think the second grade, my dad gave me A Princess of Mars, which is his book, and said, you'll want to read that someday. Of course, I had to read it right away. But I became an Edgar Rice Burroughs fan, so my mom right away started buying me. She would buy anything that I would read. I liked a lot of science books, and so we had always books coming into the house, and magazines. We had Saturday Evening Post, some of those other magazines that used to come to the house, and my mom would do them and then let us read them so that we'd be interested in this stuff. I couldn't get enough to read, but one of the things was the Ace F series, and that's where I learned who Frazetta was, because there are these amazing covers on this Ace F series, which I think were unauthorized at the time because they had lost their copyright for a while. And they were printing these amazing with Frazetta and Krenkel art. And I loved those covers. They even at a young age, they were everything I looked for. They were intriguing and scary and brilliantly done. They're just wonderful art. And then what made it better was I looked for the signature. It just said Frazetta. Who's Frazetta? Wow. And so Frazetta was a big thing to me. As we went through, I collected everything that I could get my hands on Frazetta all the way through. We didn't have the press and the internet back then. So you had to just go dig and look, and you used to go through bookstores and, oh, there's a cover by Frazetta, and I'd grab it, in a used bookstore. Or if you saw it on the stands, and you just see him around. Then I learned about EC, and I heard Frazetta had done art for that. And then I'm looking to try and find those things. years later, it impacted Dark Horse because we went from day one. I went after trying to publish the complete EC library, which we do now. We worked with Frank Frazetta. I mean, I have pictures of me sitting on the floor with Frank discussing his art. I mean, those are big moments for me, and became friends with Frank as much as you could be a friend with Frank. Frank was he was a bit of a skeptic, and loved playing baseball. That's one of his big things. And as I knew him, he ran into some situations that were tough for him. He had a stroke. Well, first he lost tons of weight. They couldn't figure out what was going on with it. And finally he went to a Mayo Clinic, I believe, and they found out that he had a gland problem. Well, his eyes bulged, and he said one day he couldn't draw, couldn't paint. He showed me the stuff he tried to do, and it was awful. I mean, it wasn't Frazetta. He said he thought he just lost it. He heard about artists burning out, losing their talent. He thought that's what it is. But he was losing weight at this time too, which is always not a good sign. I think he got under 100 pounds at one time. But anyway, he went to the Mayo Clinic, and Ellie was trying to find out what was going on with him. And they found out he had a gland problem. They gave him chemical, and it fixed his gland problem. And all of a sudden he could paint again. And just think of that. A chemical in Frank Frazetta's brain somehow was responsible for, you take that away and he's not Frazetta anymore. I've always thought about that.
Just listening to you describe this about Frazetta, what it must feel like, because it's not just a skill. It is in some way a part of your body. It's an extension of you, not your imagination, your ability to create.
But to be able to paint like he did so quickly, I mean, he'd sell paintings sometimes, and if you liked him enough, he'd keep the original and paint it again real quick, and take it in the next day. He'd say, I need to do some touch up. I'll bring it in. I mean, these are the stories about him. But, he was definitely bothered by all the people who were inspired by him, and he felt ripping him off. He felt he had created a space that people were intruding on and tried to look like his work, and it really bothered him. A lot of people would be flattered by that, but he wasn't. He felt somehow violated by so many copycats. I mean, I was doing it. I was trying to do my best to do it. Like I told you, my last painting there was definitely, you could see as soon as I started, was trying to be Frank Frazetta, and teacher just dismissed it immediately, which was a smart thing to do.
Well, in that regard, what do you think made Frazetta's art so special, and what do you think his place in the pantheon of artists is today? Why does he matter to you and everybody?
Well, I think that Frazetta's art appealed to something primitive inside us, the male heroes. We all want to be a hero, and he had the epitome for me, of that character, that fantasy character. And his women were voluptuous, and I know the combination was just and you looked at what it was up against, which were mundane. There's artists that, there's one artist who's a fine artist. I don't want to denigrate anyone, but he tried to be a lot like, he was probably the most famous of people trying to do Frazetta type work, but his figures were statues. They were frozen in a moment holding a sword, or frozen in a moment posing. And the women the same, frozen in a moment. Whereas Frazetta's characters are living, breathing. They're in the moment of action. You can see the bodies and the sweating and swaying and in motion. And it's a whole different experience. You can paint and create photographs. You couldn't photograph anything like Frazetta created. And to me, there's just no one that approached that art the same way or as successfully as Frank Frazetta. And getting to know him and sitting down and having him talk about his process. And there wasn't much process. He'd just sit down and paint stuff, and do it quick. He'd paint fast. The famous story of Clint Eastwood landing his helicopter on his ball field, and because he couldn't get to him, and talking him into doing the gauntlet. And by the way, you look at pictures of a young Eastwood and a young Frazetta, there's a lot of similarities in how they look. They both have pictures and T-shirts with the hair, and they have the same look, the same intense gaze. Ellie showed me once, took me upstairs and showed me a picture she said she didn't show many people, and it was a Frazetta Jesus over their bed. And I thought, wow, It's just, I've never seen that Jesus before, you know?
What was so distinct about it?
So intense. It was just chest up, head shot, and it was so intense. I mean, striking. Anybody walk by that would stop and have to look, you know?
Mm,
It's just Frazetta. That's how he painted. You couldn't look away. Death Dealer, we did a bronze on the Death Dealer, and Frank guided Randy Bowen, who was working on it with him. And I learned stuff I never thought of, that Frank thought of, because you have a painting of a figure. It's probably his most famous. It was on the Only Fantasy picture on the cover of American Artist when that was the big magazine. But you don't know what the backside looks like. And remember, they're painting this a two-dimensional, and you have to turn it in 3 dimensions. And I never really thought about that until Frank brought it up. And that's an interesting thing because you have to take a two-dimensional and it has to work on the back. And that was one of the problems to solve with, I'm looking at it over here. You see it right down. Do you see it?
oh, yes, yes.
And if I turn it around, you realize you had to invent that back. And, you know, you meet with these brilliant people and you learn things all the time. And I remember, look, I'm a art major and I had all my projects, some of them successful, some of them not like Frank Frazetta, of course, but you were always trying to do your best. And you hear something like that and it's just like, wow, I never thought of that, you know? And who cares about that? You know, I did. I loved learning that stuff.
It's tangential to something you brought up and not necessarily about Frazetta, but I think tied into even my experience of discovering him when I was younger, the sense of searching for art that you love and artists that you love, which is no longer the case in the age of the internet. Now, if you want to look at Frazetta, you type in his name and you have access to 50, 100 pictures, but you had to go and look through boxes. You had to not know, and you got to discover something. And part of the thrill was to discover moments of beauty that you didn't know existed.
I remember going with Bud Plant. You ever hear of Bud Plant? He used to sell books. He was a big book dealer and fantasy books and stuff. And we became friends. I used to buy from him when I started my first store. And anyway, we would be in a town just because of all the convention stuff. We'd go to a used bookstore and we would look to discover new artists that we didn't know. We'd go in a certain section and look. And when you found somebody, and, you know, I wish I could remember. If he was here, he'd probably tell you right away, but I wish I could, because I found one that blew us both away. And how do I not know this artist? It's when Jeff Darrow showed up. Our first convention in San Diego, we just had a table. It was in the old convention table. You just had a table with stand-up something that you Velcroed, pick art that you brought down to the back. And I remember Dave Stevens was across from us. I didn't even know him there. We're sitting there talking to people, brand new company. We're trying to talk to people. And here's this guy standing over, tall guy. Jeff's, I don't know, 6'2", maybe 6'3", maybe 6'4". I don't know. He was tall. But he just stood there looking at us. And I walk over. I told Randy, and I've told Jeff this story. So I walked over and told Randy, I'm going to go look at this guy. I'm sort of weirded out. I'm going to go see what he wants. So I walk over there. And he says, well, I have some art I'd like to show you. You probably won't like it. I mean, it's self-effacing. And I said, sure. I always say yes. I mean, some of our editors like to be real tough on them. Not me. I want to encourage them. If they love drawing, I don't want to tell them, you're really awful. Some of them are really awful. But I want to encourage them to draw. And I love it when they come down here because I can show them the wall with all the most famous comic artists in the world up there and say, that's who you're competing against. So you have to practice. You have to get that good. And I like saying that. And that's sort of the message I give. I'll try to give them as much positive as I can because if you have talent, it's just practice. It's like basketball. The more you practice, the better you get. It's the same thing with art. So I told Jeff, come on over. Let me see it. So he lays it out. I see this thing he was doing with Mobius, Jean Giraud. And I pull the next page. And then Randy comes over. We're both standing with our mouth on the floor. And I said, how come I don't know you? How come I don't know who you are? those moments are so exciting to this guy. And so Jeff and I have worked together ever since, you know. I chased after him hard, and it's a pivotal point in Dark Horse because Jeff said he was working on a book with Frank Miller. Well, I hadn't really been able to get to Frank. So I said, well, just give me a chance with him. When this book is done, just give me a chance. Well, it was over a year later, maybe 2 years, and I get this call from Jeff, and he says, okay, be at Traction Avenue in Los Angeles at so o'clock tomorrow. So I told Randy, we're catching a plane. We flew down there, we went there, and Frank comes in, and he puts down a pen and a paper and maybe a calculator. I can't remember. He puts it down, and he says, okay, pitch. Jeff told me, we said hi, who we were, and he said, okay, what's your pitch? And I said, I had prepared every dollar spent on a comic book, from what are the distribution charges, what's the printing costs at different levels, what it costs to do everything. And I handed it to him as 4 or 5 sheets, and if I remember correctly. And he looked at it and was silent, and he just put the stuff back in his pocket and said, meet me here tomorrow, and he left. Oh, he said, how much do you want? I said, how much do you want? We'll take 10%. You can have 90. And he just looked at me, put the stuff and said, meet me here tomorrow, and left. He came back the next day and shook hands and said, we're going to go with you. He told me later that he went home and called Dave Gibbons because they were doing another book together, and it was Give Me Liberty. And he said, I met this producer or this publisher who just gave me the keys to the kingdom, because they used to get 3-line reports. They never knew what the charges were for or why it was so much. So I handed him that, and Frank called people and told him. I mean, and when they announced that Hard Boiled and Give Me Liberty were coming to Dark Horse, that started a stampede, because Frank going to a non-Marvel in DC, all of a sudden all the creators, you know, who talk to him, who are looking to do something, all started coming to Dark Horse. So, I mean, we got Art Adams and Mignola finally came and said, well, I've got a book. You won't want to do it. And I said, what is it? Because I'd been chasing him for a long time. And again, it's one of those things that I saw some of his work and something connected with me. So I know this guy's going to be a great artist. You look at the early work and it's nowhere near where his art is, for instance, today. But a lot of those artists, something just clicked when I looked at it.
It's nothing more amazing than that moment of discovering something that in art, you know, just seeing something and feeling like, how did I not know this for the last 20 years of my life? This existed, that could have made everything better, clearer in some way, filled me with wonder like this all that time.
Franklin Booth was one of those people who you see his cities, everybody steals his cities and fantasy stuff. And then I remember finding Franklin Booth when I was in college and thinking, how come I didn't know who this guy was? You know who Franklin Booth is?
I do.
He is spectacular. Or Scoyton, who does this amazing cities with people trying to navigate these cities. It's just, I remember all the moments. I remember as a kid walking in to the local comic rack, and I'm ready to buy, I've got 25 cents. I can buy 2 dime comics. And while I'm looking, I see over here, and it says The Spirit. And I pick this thing up, and the logo is part of the landscape, 3-dimensional logo. And I'm looking at this thing, and I flip through it. Wow, this looks pretty good. I never heard of this. And I put it down, and I go, and I kept looking at it, and I kept going, and I kept looking back. And I finally broke down. I had to buy it. And that was my introduction to The Spirit. Worked with Will many years, became a good friend. In fact, when he died, he was working his last thing he was working on was for Dark Horse. He was supposed to be in and out of the hospital quickly because he had a heart valve that was leaking, and they're going to fix it. And his wife wanted him to go to a Mayo Clinic or something. He said, no, the local hospital's okay. So he went there, and it started leaking during the night, and his blood pressure kept dropping. Nobody paid attention, and it's sad. He was a good friend. He liked to talk to me because I was writing comics and publishing comics, and that's what he did. So he was inquisitive and always wanted to know about the new market and how things were changing. He wanted to be on top of it. And so we had so many great conversations just over then. I finally got him to come out here to Portland and spend a few days here. And we had some amazing talks that I'll always remember. Though some of them will be in my book that I write someday. I can't die with all of these stories I have.
They're great stories. One last question about Frazetta. You talked about becoming friends with him at the end of his life.
The last 10 years or so, but I knew about him because when I opened my store in 1980, see, all of these things are connected. I opened the store and I had to have Frazetta posters, and you called Ellie Frazetta. So I knew Ellie Frazetta for years, calling her, ordering product from her. And I'd call her and says, okay, Mike, how many do you want? You know, she was the ultimate salesperson. I have, if you look in my house, I have the Egyptian queen that Frank drew in pencil, part of a border drawing. And Ellie said, we did a very limited edition poster and you need to have one of these, Mike. So I said, how much? $2,000, but Frank will do the drawing, original drawing on it. I said, great, I'll have one of, are you kidding? $2,000 original Frank Frazetta. And so we went to the doctor's office with him and came back, and Ellie said, so you remember you're paying $3,000 for that poster. And I thought, oh, I didn't say anything. I thought it was two. And then at dinner, when I left after dinner, she said, now remember, give me my $5,000. You know, I sent it right away because who knows where it was going.
When he died, do you think he understood the impact of his art on the culture? Did he feel that he mattered?
He knew.
Okay, good.
Yeah, he definitely knew. I talked to him a number of times. I sat on his floor once just talking about his art and the effect it had on me. And he knew, and one of the reasons, demonstrations that he was not happy with all the people ripping him off. In his mind, he was ripped off. But you know, there's a thin line there because me too, I wanted to draw like Frank Frazetta. And it was my teacher that said, don't do it. He already did it. And so that makes you think, he's right. I can never do Frank Frazetta. So but you love the work so much, you want to try and create it yourself. So you just have to create your own style. I've had that talk with kids a lot. Create your own style. Don't rip somebody off. It's the things you learn, like I say, going through. And I think I met Frank late 90s and somewhere in the, mid to late, maybe mid 90s, and knew him until he died. But the last thing I wanted to do when Frank was on oxygen and you were worried about him, and I wanted to do autobiography, hardcover of Frank's life. And he didn't want to do it. He said, people have already written everything about me. I said, but there needs to be a place to go to. No, he said, no, everybody knows about me. Nobody wants that. And Ellie really wanted to do that. She thought that would be a great thing to have after they were gone. And she was very sad. Last time I saw her, she was very sad that he really just didn't want to do it. He wasn't interested in it. I think he felt he had done his thing and it was there and it didn't need any more. Nobody needed to point it out or talk about him. The art was there and it stood for itself.
I'm grateful it's still there. Thank you for suggesting this conversation. It's been great to be able to talk about him and his work with you and the entire conversation. I've enjoyed all of it. Thanks for taking the time, Mike.
Sure, no problem.
As for you listening, thank you yet again for your support of 5 a.m. Story Talk. If you have any questions about this episode, make your way to the comments section with them and I'll do my best to answer you. If you enjoyed what you just listened to, rating this episode or podcast with 5 stars, a thumbs up, whatever is appropriate, it'll go a long way to helping 5 a.m. Story Talk grow. That's it for now. I'll see you next time, my friends.